On his last night hosting BBC's flagship news programme Newsnight, presenter Evan Davis noted that the last few decades of Western politics had been dominated by what he summed up as Clinton's 1992 claim, "It's the economy, stupid." The focus on interest rates, GDP, taxes, it was all a reflection of the prevailing idea that it was people's material conditions that really mattered. The candidate that can best handle the economy wins. People voted with their wallets in mind, and people's decisions are based primarily on material needs. People want to be fed, housed, have money to spend, and they want the same for their friends and family. Davis argued, though, that in the last few years a shift had occurred. He said that what actually seems to matter to people are belonging, community, groups, respect. In public discourse, topics have shifted to issues like multiculturalism, identity, gender, religion, homophobia, much of it based around the plight of minority groups and/or oppression. Is this really a recent shift, though? And what really drives these political beliefs? The question, what matters to people, is a similar question to what drives history. What is the prime cause of a big political shift, an historic election, a war, a revolution? Poverty, desperation, ideas, ideology? The idea that it's the economy, stupid, is a looser interpretation of the Marxist idea of economic determinism. For Marx, the mode, forces and relations of production, the tools, factories and relationships between employees and bosses, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, determined all other life. Law, politics, culture, ideology, the superstructure are all a manifestation of the economic conditions of the base. In other words, the food and goods manufactured, the rhythms of work and material needs, the economy, stupid, or the base, determines what happens in politics, culture, discourse, the superstructure. Imagine two events: me eating a burger and the French Revolution. What's the primary cause of each? For the first, there's hunger, which is biological. There's a cultural cause, the burger, the bun, the cheese. It's arbitrary, American, cultural, it's tied up with history. Then there's my tastes, which might be both biological and a product of my environment growing up. Then there's my location now, what I can access. And then there's a material or economic cause. I swapped money for it, I worked for it. Some of these causes I control, and some I don't, but they make up a kind of chart of causes, and they interact in some way in my brain, at the point where psychology and sociology collide. We can represent the causes of the French Revolution in the same way. There was an economic cause, the poverty of the peasantry, the desire of the bourgeoisie to consolidate their position and create wealth for themselves. There was the financial position of the country after the king's overspending during the 7 Years' War. There was the ineptitude of the king, the writings of the philosophers Ruccio and Voltaire, the Enlightenment. Every action of the French Revolution is made up of these interconnected causes. The job of the historian is to point to causes and argue which deserves emphasis, to put them into a narrative. A Marxist would argue that the economic causes dominate. Even my desire to eat a burger is, under the surface, connected to America's cultural domination through wealth, the spread of burgers over the world, on film and on television, and my material position to be able to buy one. Marx insisted that man's material life explained the movements of history. He and Engels wrote that morality, religion, metaphysics, all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness thus no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history, no development, but men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter, along with this, their real existence, their thinking, and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness by life. And you don't have to be a Marxist to believe this. Many non-Marxist historians and economists have argued the same. Charles Beard argued that the economic position of the Founding Fathers caused American independence more than the philosophy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This leads us to one frequent postmodern criticism of the modernism that Marx represents, that something outside of human control determines history. Either God or some kind of mystical progress, some kind of economic law or scientific discoveries. In this view, humans are just puppets dancing to the tune of outside forces. As Stephen Cullenberg and others write in the book Post-Modernism, Economics and Knowledge, "It's the economy, stupid" is not just taken by many economists as an adage of what should count in the political opinions of social agents. It's taken even more to describe a grand chain of social causation, in which the economy, here including alternative entry points as labour, utility, rational choice and so forth, is seen as the motivating agency behind all consequent social outcomes. This means we aren't as in control of our actions and our desires as much as we'd like to think. On the other hand, the existentialist and postmodern philosophers of the 20th century began to emphasise freedom, contingency, that's chance, and more generally, the ability for humans to construct their own meaning in the world, to be the authors of their actions. I didn't eat the burger primarily because of economic forces. I ate it because I wanted to. I made a free choice after weighing up the options. The French Revolution happened because that's just what people wanted. They actively designed it and willed it. In 1954, the Hungarian economist Karl Polanyi criticised the weight given to economic determinism. Across the 19th century, it was easy to believe in this because of the growth of capitalism through the Industrial Revolution and its spread across Europe. For Polanyi, though, it wasn't the material world that drove history, but the idea of the material world. The world is bourgeois because people believe it to be. Our institutions are embodiments of human meaning and purpose, he wrote. We give meaning to the world through institutions like banks, governments and universities, but after a while, the norms institutions instill in us present themselves as fact and reality, rather than the human-made beliefs they originally were. Similarly, the economist John Maynard Keynes wrote in 1936 that "I am sure the power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Sooner or later, it is ideas, not vested interests, which are dangerous for good or evil." In the middle of the 20th century, Marxists themselves were asking difficult questions about their theory of economic determinism. For Marxists, revolution was meant to take place in the most advanced countries in Europe, Britain, Germany, countries with an industrialised workforce, with strong class consciousness, where the race to the bottom was impoverishing an increasing proportion of the population to below subsistence level living. Instead, it happened in Russia. For Lenin, at the time, the answer to this was that Russia was the weakest link in a chain of imperialist states. Russian society contained the most contradictions, recently feudal still, predominantly peasant, but increasingly capitalist and imperialist, but still ruled by a czar and a bloated priesthood. Russia was a boiling pot. The chain snapped. The French Marxist Louis Althusser called this overdetermination. That is, it's the bursting plurality of causes that determines events. For Althusser, Marx's economic determinism had been misunderstood. He wrote, "Marx has given us the two ends of the chain and has told us to find out what goes on between them. On the one hand, determination in the last instance by the economic mode of production. On the other, the relative autonomy of the superstructures and their specific effectivity. Production is the determinant factor, but only in the last instance. That is, humans are free to produce events, but in a limited economic and cultural framework. And when it comes down to it, if push came to shove, economics and material circumstances will dominate." The belief that we can create our own ideas and reinterpret and remould the world around us is, I think, one of the defining characteristics of 20th century thought, most exemplified in Sartre's atheistic existentialism. That man is, he argued, essentially free. His existence precedes his essence. In the mid-20th century, the linguistic turn in philosophy marked a major shift towards emphasising how language is the primary way we interpret, understand, and reimagine the world. Logical positivists argued that philosophy should make empirical observations about the world and then work to clarify logical statements about those observations. Language about real-world events should then progress to be increasingly precise. Post-structuralists, on the other hand, pointed to how language was subjective, fluid, historical, and cultural, but also determined by power relations. This meant that language about race, class, sex were all both socially constructed and able to be displaced and changed. While I don't want to make a definitive argument about this, I think it's fair to say that this emphasis on language has coalesced into what is loosely referred to as identity politics. This is not a critique or a defence of identity politics. I think the term itself is problematic, and that movements that organise around identity have both positive and negative features. But the weight in public discourse given to language, to pronouns and political correctness, or as Davis says, to belonging, community, groups, respect, is something that is born out of post-war academic ideas about culture, the subject, the public sphere, power, and language, the freedom of the linguistic turn, existentialism, and post-structuralism. The essence of the argument is that identity is primarily constructed, and so rather than being the subject of economic determinism, or God's children, or perfectly rational Cartesians, we are both determined by the world around us, and have the ability to change the world by the power of our own ideas. So the big question, what's the point in all this? If we can't really get to the bottom of causation, and there are no real lessons in history, is there anything we can learn? In the book The Lure of Greatness, Anthony Barnett describes how the elitist, globalist, liberal era of Clinton, Blair, Bush, Brown, Cameron politics presided over a world of increasing economic inequality, globalisation and alienation under a myopic and triumphalist call that it was the end of history. For Barnett, the failures of the politicians of this era were blatantly dishonest government, protracted military defeat, economic calamity generating widespread insecurity, and state-supported elite hyperwealth and corruption. When we look at all this and the last 20 years of Western politics, and the focus on identity now, we have, in Althusser's terms, events which are overdetermined. Trump and Brexit might be said to be the results of these overdetermined events. We can see the public sphere stretching thin. On the one hand, Brexit and Trump happened in the context of increasing inequality and a neoliberal landscape that facilitated the 2008 crash. On the other hand, they happened with reference to ideas like sovereignty, taking back control, Judeo-Christian values. So if we return to our pie chart, what are the causes that deserve emphasis? How will historians look back on these last few years? It's obviously a difficult question, and I don't think we have the distance yet to make any convincing arguments. And as the philosopher David Hume pointed out in the 18th century, it's impossible to ever see causation, only correlation, and different explanations are often two sides of the same coin. Economic commentator Martin Wolf of the Financial Times argues that it's impossible to separate the two phenomena of cultural and economic causes. Immigration, for example, is both an economic and cultural phenomenon. I think, though, the lesson of Russia in 1917 is an instructive one. If the public sphere gets stretched too far, it snaps. As Barnett writes, unless the cultural left, with its embrace of feminism, human rights, multiculturalism, gay rights, environmental and planetary humanism, also engages with and wins over the working classes, there will be no alliance to drive the Trumpists from power. Rights, liberty, the freedoms we've come to take for granted, they've always depended on the consent of the community. They are embedded in our societies by consensus. Overdetermination, the building up of contradictions, the public sphere and inequality stretched too far, elicits sharp warnings from history. Rhetorically adept strongmen thrive on fracture to claim they can save the day. The divide of the liberal public sphere means we must recognise a communal vacuum at its centre. Community requires common ground, reaching out, debate and conversation rather than argument, blame and vitriol, goodwill and an open mind to another point of view. Okay, so some good news. The channel has been remonetized, which is certainly a weight off my mind, but no explanations have been given as to why it was demonetized in the first place. Thanks to all my new Patreon supporters who have given in response to this. It is, as always, massively appreciated. I just want to add though that the revenue I get from YouTube for these videos is minuscule. Patreon is still the only way this channel survives, so my request to you remains. If you think you get as much value from 4 of these videos as just 1 cup of coffee, then please consider pledging just $1 per video on Patreon. That's a maximum of $4 per month. You can even limit your pledge to $1 per month. I'm really looking forward to pushing this channel in new directions in 2019. I've loved making videos every week for the past 6 months or so, and as usual, thank you so much to those that have subscribed, shared, liked and watched in the first place. So thanks for watching, see you next week and have a happy new year.